Hi, Bernardo.
Hi there.
How you doing?
Hi, Robert. Great. Yourself?
I can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Bernardo Kastrup, a Dutch, computer scientist by training, but in addition to having a PhD in computer science, you have a PhD in philosophy. You also have a cat, it looks like. Is that a cat I see?
Yeah. That's Floki.
Yeah. Nice. Your
usually
cat,
he's on the other side. Usually he's here.
Well, he should feel free to roam. You think your cat has consciousness? This is what we'll be talking about.
Absolutely. He has private conscious inner life, yeah.
And by that, we mean it is like something to be your cat, to use the formulation of Thomas Nagel, right? We can agree that that's what we mean when we say something is conscious.
Yes, phenomenal consciousness. There is something it is like to be my cat. So my cat is phenomenally conscious or just conscious. Okay.
So let me continue a little bit. So as I said, you have a PhD in philosophy, and that has come to characterize your public identity more than the computer science. You've become pretty well known for talking about a particular view on the consciousness question known as idealism, and a particular variant of that, I guess. That has a long tradition in both Western and Eastern philosophy. So Berkeley was an idealist. I think you claim Schopenhauer as being very much in your lineage. In fact, you wrote a book about Schopenhauer recently called Decoding Schopenhauer's Metaphysics. A couple of your other books are The Idea of the World and earlier, Why Materialism is Baloney. And maybe that gives us some hint of what idealism means, but we'll get to that. Anyway, in addition to having a tradition of Western philosophy, idealism is very much associated with ancient Indian philosophy, the Vedantic stuff, and Schopenhauer himself, I think, felt a kinship with Vedantic philosophy. So what I want to, first of all, before we try to, as I said, I think people may have trouble wrapping their mind around your view, and I want to work hard to help us all do that. But I want to first say that it's in the nature of the problem of consciousness, it seems to me, that people who are arguing about it often have trouble understanding what the other person is either saying. You know what I mean? I mean, there are a lot of issues where you disagree with the person, but you understand exactly what their position is. With consciousness, it seems to me not infrequently, you're either saying, I don't even understand how you're conceiving of this thing, or you're saying, you do not understand what my position even is. I would think that you face that problem even more than most. It must be pretty common for people to say, what the hell are you talking about, right?
That's right. That's the main issue.
Is what the hell Bernardo is talking about.
Yeah, when I say that idealism means that reality is all in mind, people think that reality is impersonal, individual minds, because they cannot conceive of mind as a type of existence, of existent. They can only conceive of mind as an individual mind cooped up in a head. And so they misunderstand idealism as a form of solipsism, as a statement that all reality is in your mind. Right. But that's not what idealism is saying. Idealism is saying there is a reality out there beyond our personal minds, but that reality too is mental in essence.
Yeah. So you're not saying that I am a mere illusion that you're having and that I don't actually exist, which I'm gratified to hear. I haven't ruled out the possibility that it's the other way around, that you are the illusion, but I'm certainly glad to hear you don't think I'm an illusion. So let me try to give you my understanding of what you're saying, or at least to get as far along as I can in that monologue before you interrupt me and tell me I've got something wrong. Okay. So I think most people think of the physical world as being the fundamental thing, and consciousness, subjective experience, or as you say, mind, and I think you're using mind as roughly synonymous with consciousness?
Correct.
Okay. They see that as something that's associated with part of the material world. Okay. But I think most people, if they pause to think about it, they think there was a time when there was no consciousness. the universe gets created. It's this physical thing. It exists. There is the material world. But I think most people would say that it's with the advent of life, living systems, that you might start getting subjective experience. But the material world is what's fundamental, first of all, temporally. It existed before consciousness. The average kind of person would say there are these panpsychists who think that all material has some consciousness associated with it, but let's leave them aside. I think the average intuition is that the material world existed before consciousness existed, that even now consciousness is only associated with a subset of the material world. And in that sense, it's kind of an add-on. It's something that parts of the material world have. I have consciousness. And you take issue with that. You're saying that, no, it's consciousness that's fundamental. In fact, it's so fundamental that I don't think you'd even say the material world as we normally conceive it is the add-on. You're not just asking us to reverse the relationship, I think, and think of consciousness as fundamental. And then there's also this material world. You're saying the material world as we conceive it is really just not at all the material world as we conceive it. It is only a manifestation of consciousness.
That is correct. Yet there is a lot in the intuition that you were describing. Individual consciousness, individuated consciousness, separate consciousness did arise at some point in the history of the cosmos. It wasn't there from the beginning, and it did arise when life arose. So life is what individuated consciousness looks like. Or to speak a more technical term, life is what dissociated aspects of mind look like when observed from the outside.
So parts of mind that are kind of severed off, like my consciousness is just a part of the universal consciousness that is kind of, it is discrete, it is distinct, and yet there is some kind of continuity with the universal consciousness.
That's correct. So what you lose is what we might call associative inference. What you lose is the ability to link your thoughts and cognitively associate them with something that's happening beyond you, beyond your personal self. So you become cognitively isolated. Now, we know this happens in mind. We know it happens in human minds. Humans can become internally dissociated. It's called dissociative identity disorder in the psychiatric literature. We know that dissociative processes in the brain of a person suffering from dissociative identity disorder look like something identifiable. You can diagnose people with dissociative identity disorder, or DID, by looking at functional MRI or brain scanner images. So those dissociative processes look like something. So the argument is that in the mind of nature, when dissociation happens, the resulting dissociative processes look like something. And what they look like is what we call biology, life, metabolism. But that doesn't mean that before life arose, there was no consciousness. There was consciousness. Consciousness is the only thing that exists. But before the rise of life, there was no dissociated aspect of consciousness.
So was it like something to be the universe before life existed?
I think there has always been something it is like to be the universe, even before life existed. And if you could go back in time to a point before life arose and look at the universe, you would see a material, what we call colloquially a material or physical universe, very similar to what we see today, just more than 4 billion years ago. But if no dissociated aspect of consciousness were looking at it, then the only thing that would be experienced would be the first-person perspective of the universe. In other words, what it is like to be the universe as opposed to what it is like to observe the universe.
Now, is this a variant of panpsychism then? There's something you have in common with panpsychists, but are you a panpsychist? Or, again, so panpsychists think that there is some degree of consciousness or sentience or something associated with every physical thing, every atom, right? Are they, what's the relationship between you and them?
Very little, surprisingly little. Panpsychists acknowledge that physical entities have standalone existence. Idealists think that physical entities are just appearances. They are what mental processes look like when observed from a certain perspective. to speak more technically, when observed from across a dissociative boundary. So physical entities under idealism have no standalone existence. They are just forms of manifestation, appearances, images, extrinsic appearances of something that is inherently mental. Panpsychists acknowledge that physical entities do have standalone existence, and they have fundamental properties like mass, charge, spin. Oh, and in addition, they have the property of being conscious, fundamentally. So all they achieve is to avoid the explanation, because you just say, well, consciousness is fundamental, so I don't need to reduce it. But there is still a physical world that is conscious. While I say that the physical world is in consciousness, not that it is conscious. And there is a tremendous difference here. And I think panpsychism is flawed for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that it is physically incoherent. It is contradictory with quantum field theory, for instance.
Oh yeah, I should write down quantum physics in case we have time to get to it. I'm afraid the nature of this conversation is going to be a little tangential, just because you raise questions in my mind, and I think maybe answering them would help shed light. I promise to try to get back to all the main branches we're on before we take the tangent. So, I mean, one thing that occurred to me listening to you is like, I think one thing that is appealing to materialists about materialism is that it seems really super clear cut. Like with evolution, let's talk about natural selection, okay? You'd probably agree that when it's described in material terms, okay, you start at the very beginning, for whatever reason, you have these self-replicating strands of physical information. They're just patterns, physical pattern. They replicate themselves. When errors happen in the copying process and you get a pattern that's even better at replicating itself, that pattern will persist and will outcompete patterns that are not so good at that. And you can follow that, as different as that may sound, that pattern from being a human being, you can follow that logic very clearly all the way up through the creation of the cell, the complex cell, multicellular life, humans. It all really makes sense. Everything in my body can be clearly explained by reference to that. And moreover, it's kind of a testable hypothesis. There are a lot of things that seem to only make sense in light of the theory of natural selection. And I guess people would say, wait, you're asking me to replace that view, which is so appealing, with the view that really what's fundamental is this super mushy stuff that I can't think about clearly, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah. There's so much wrong in what you said, and so much right as well. Look, idealism doesn't replace science. Idealism is an ontology, not a scientific theory. Scientific theories predict the behavior of nature. But to be clear,
and I know that and I understand your view, which is that if you back that materialism is not an inherent property of a scientific worldview. It's something that comes along. But what science is the study of regularities and the coming up with laws that help you predict the regularities. But you can do science without being confident there's a physical world out there. I understand that. So I'm not saying, do you understand what's appealing about a scientific worldview? I'm saying, do you understand what's appealing about specifically the materialist kind of incarnation, so to speak, of a scientific worldview? Just to be,
I understood your question.
Okay.
I understood your question. Idealism does not replace our understanding of causation. Yeah. Neither does it contradict it. So all of those patterns you were talking about that underlie the evolution of life on this planet, how cells evolve and become multicellular organisms reacting to environmental pressures and the accrual of genetic mutations that leads to greater fit, all of this is still correct. There is no reason to throw away any reliable part of science because of idealism. So, because the world that we see around us does exist. And it is outside of us as individual minds. None of that is denied. What is denied is the following. Physicalists assume or infer that this world of qualities around us, this world of colors, melodies, flavors.
And by physicalists, we mean materialists.
Materialists. I use the word materialists now. So materialists assume that the world of qualities we see is actually created by our brains. There are no colors out there. There are no flavors out there, because colors and flavors are qualities, and qualities are somehow, in a way that nobody could ever explain, generated by our brain inside the skull. But there is a world out there that is quality-less. It has no qualities. It's pure abstraction. So all of those patterns that you were talking about, the evolution of life on this planet, they actually were patterns of abstraction. If we would see those patterns, then our brains would somehow engender up some qualities that we would experience within our heads. But the world as it is in itself would have none of those qualities. It would be pure abstraction. Idealism grants that there is that world. It grants that those patterns did unfold and have led to the evolution of life and ultimately to us. But idealism says they are not pure abstraction. Those patterns are patterns of transpersonal mentation. They are something we can have some relationship with, that we can say more precisely what it is. It is mentation, and we are all acquainted with mentation.
By mentation, you mean mental activity?
Mental processes, mental activity of the kind of thoughts. So we can conceive of the world as it is in itself, as opposed to pure abstraction, like materialism. We can conceive of it as transpersonal thoughts. And now we have to be wary of anthropomorphizing those kinds of thoughts. They are not thoughts like ours. These are instinctive, predictable, transpersonal, thought-like processes. But if you were to observe those thought-like processes throughout the course of evolution, you would have seen those cells and those patterns of causation, the accrual of genetic mutations. All of those things, the cells, the genetic mutations, would have been the extrinsic appearances of what is, in and of itself, transpersonal mental processes that just appear to you in the form of cells and the accrual of genetic mutations, and so on and so forth. So our understanding of the causal chain that has led to us is left untouched by idealism. What idealism solves are other problems, like the problem of the hard problem of consciousness. How does the brain somehow generate consciousness? That problem is eliminated under idealism.
Now, that's what you take to be the so-called hard problem of consciousness, is like, how do you get, well, I think Colin McGinn called it the water into wine problem. How do you get from the physical stuff? What is the process of translation from physical stuff into this subjective stuff? That's what you think of as the hard problem?
That's correct. So to frame it more strictly, the hard problem is the following. There is nothing about physical parameters which are purely quantitative, in terms of which we could deduce, at least in principle, the qualities of experience.
Right.
There is no bridge between the two. They are incommensurable domains. But that problem only arises if you think that the brain causes individual consciousness. But if you think that the brain is what individual consciousness looks like from across a dissociative boundary, then you still have the precise correlations between brain activity and inner experience, because the former is what the latter looks like when observed from the outside. But you no longer have to explain how purely quantitative parameters such as mass, charge, momentum, spin, frequency, amplitude, magically translate into colors and melodies and flavors, because they don't translate. They are an appearance, not the cause.
Right. Although I think a lot of people would say, well, it's good that you've laid to rest one challenging problem that we couldn't wrap our minds around. It's just that now they're having trouble wrapping their minds around the idea that what they see as the physical world is the manifestation of this mushy stuff. Right.
It's extremely intuitive, in fact. It's just that our culture over the last 2 centuries or so has manufactured artificial plausibility from materialism, which is probably the worst, least tenable ontological option on the table today. But you can get intuition about that in the following way. Suppose you're sad, you're devastatingly sad. You feel that sadness. It's a concrete, present reality for you. You are directly acquainted with it. So much so that you almost are the sadness. If you look at yourself in the mirror while you're feeling that, you will see tears running down your eyes and contorted facial muscles. The tears and the contorted facial muscles, material, physical stuff, they are what your sadness looks like when observed from an outside perspective on a mirror. as opposed to when experienced directly, feeling the sadness. So there you have a direct intuition about how the matter of your body is the appearance of what you feel from the inside, your conscious inner life, your sadness. Sadness on the inside, when observed from the outside, material tears, material contorted facial muscles. Now you just extrapolate this to all matter, including matter that's not part of a biological living organism, the matter of the moons and quasars and stars and solar systems, that those two are the extrinsic appearance of transpersonal mental processes, which are not human-like. They do probably, almost certainly, do not have higher level mental functions, such as the ability to introspect, self-awareness, to think deliberately about things and create plans. No, they just unfold spontaneously. Very simple mentation in a certain sense, but mentation which also appears as matter when observed from across a dissociative boundary. Which dissociative boundary? Our dissociative boundary. The boundary that characterizes us as individual living beings as opposed to the universe at large.
So the dissociative boundary is what we think of as the bounds of the self.
Of the personal self.
Of the
yes,
personal
the word
self
in the East is used in a transpersonal sense. But yes, in the West, the dissociative boundary is the boundary of your personal self.
Yeah. Let me ask you something. You know, I've done meditation retreats. I wrote a book about meditation called Why Buddhism is True. And I've had the experience on retreat of being, you know, like a week into the retreat or something, when your nature of your consciousness is really starting to change pretty fundamentally. And one experience I've had is suddenly, you know, it's like I feel, say, a tingling in my feet, and I hear a bird singing. And for a while, the tingling in my feet seems no more or less a part of me than the bird singing, okay? The bounds of the self have started to dissolve. Now, in your metaphysics, what's going on at that point?
Well, I think you're still a dissociated alternative.
What does that word mean, by the way? I've seen ALTER. That's the word alter?
Yeah, that's the technical word used in psychiatry to identify the dissociated centers of awareness in a person suffering from dissociative identity disorder.
Or multiple personality disorders, it used to be called.
That's the old name, yeah.
Right, okay. So, and by the way, they have different personalities at different times, right? The idea isn't that they have them at the same time, right?
Actually, there is very compelling evidence that they are all active at the same time. They are all co-conscious, but not all in executive control. So only one alter has control of the body, if you will, assumes control over the executive functions of the body. Yeah. But the alters that are not in executive control, they remain co-conscious. There's a lot of evidence for that now emerging.
Fascinating. So wait, where were we before I got you to define alter? You're younger than me. You tell us where we were.
The individual self and Buddhism and your experiences in meditation.
Okay. So I was still dissociated, you're saying, but there was something going on, right?
Yeah. Okay. So because you were hearing the bird, you were hearing a sound, that's a perceptual experience. I think perceptual experiences are only possible if there is a dissociative boundary, because perception is the mental impingement of a mental process outside the dissociative boundary, impinging on the dissociative boundary. And we call that perception. Things that touch your skin, photons that hit your retina, and so forth. So you were still perceiving the bird. So there was still a dissociative boundary. Otherwise, you would be the bird.
But wait, I also perceive things from within my body, and that's within my dissociative shell, right?
Do you really call that? You could say that there is bodily perception, because your nervous system is not your entire body.
I think what I was kind of realizing at that moment is that there actually isn't much different. I mean, there are reports from my foot, there are reports from the bird, you know, but I'm kind of sensing them. Well, I'm sensing the foot thing in my foot, kind of. I don't know. Anyway, go ahead.
I'll get there. I was not through yet.
Yeah.
So yes, there is bodily perception as well, but that's just your nerve terminations inside your body that perceive certain bodily processes. It's still perception. Your nervous system as a whole is still sort of a dissociated aspect of mentation
Wow.
collect information from the outside through outside impingement on the dissociative boundary. Now, in addition to this very low level, a biological thing, perception, which reflects the lowest level of dissociation. In addition to that, what leads us to identify as separate entities is an inner narrative. It's a story we are constantly telling ourselves about what we are and what we are not. And I know that so palpably because when I was about 9 or 10 years old, I started, for 6 months, I had that tremendously strange thought, that realization that I am me. I am not the things I see, the things I hear around me. I must be me. Not only that, I have never been these things outside me. That's culture beginning to assert itself on you. And that felt so weird. The thought that I was not the world I perceived around me. So weird. That was the rise of that mental narrative of a personal self. And what you can get through and see through in meditation is this narrative. And you realize that the bird is just as much a part of the mind that you are as your inner bodily processes and your inner sadness, your inner wishes, your fears, your desires, and so on and so forth. But because you still have perception, there is still that fundamental layer of dissociation. Otherwise, you wouldn't hear the bird. You would be the bird. You would know what it is like to be the bird. You would know what it is like to be the universe,
right,
as opposed to perceiving the universe. So you were still dissociated, but you punched through the layer of narrative making.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that I think most people don't have to have an epiphany at age 9 to decide that they are just them. I think for most people, that's the default assumption. Yeah. And that's why I'm a little honestly skeptical of the idea that until a couple of centuries ago, everybody really got the picture. And then suddenly we started, thinking of ourselves as fundamentally, thinking of the material world as material and so on. I personally think materialism is a very natural intuition, which isn't to say I think it's true. I haven't run into many people who said, it wasn't until I was 10, I realized that I wasn't that wall, right? I mean,
okay, look, what people consider to be the intuitive aspect of materialism is actually contradicted by materialism. Most people think that materialism means that the world of qualities you see around you really exists outside of you as qualities. Well, materialism denies that. Materialism says that the world of qualities you experience is generated somehow in some magical way by your brain inside your skull. So when you look up to the sky in a clear night and you see a bright star, the star you see, the qualities you perceive, are underneath the surface of your skull and not out there in space, because it's your brain generating the qualities that you call the star. Now, there is something outside your real skull, but that something is entirely abstract. It has no qualities. You can't visualize it. The best you can do is to say that it's a bunch of mathematical equations floating in a vacuum. But even that is too much. It's less than that. It's pure abstraction. So materialism, if you really understand what materialism means and what its implications are, it is not intuitive at all. It's just that people think of materialism as something else. They think of materialism as idealism, because it's idealism that says the real world of qualities is outside your head. It's not generated inside your skull. Your skull is an appearance of a mental process. It's not the generator of that world you see around you. So we have a perverse game of, steal or switch, in which materialism is popular because, one, people don't understand what it means, and two, it is so incomplete that anything that you see in terms of empirical evidence can, in principle, be accommodated by materialism, because materialism doesn't say at all how the brain generates experience. So whatever we see in terms of the correlations between experience and brain activity, in principle, materialism can accommodate it because it doesn't make a statement. So cruelly, what materialism has going for it that's most important is ignorance and incompleteness.
Let me ask you about a particular case of perception that is, I think, kind of related to what you're saying. So people think of plants as green, right? But actually, green is the one thing plants aren't. The reason they see plants as green is because plants reject green light. The red light, other kinds of light, they can make use of and convert into energy. Green light, they have no use for, so they deflect it and it hits your eye. And yet we think of plants as green. Is that at all related to what you're saying?
Yes, but what I'm saying goes even deeper, because although materialism rejects that there is green at all out there in the world, that green is produced magically by our brain inside our skull, materialism does say that the contours, the silhouettes, the forms, angles, and geometric relationships we see on the screen of perception correspond to real geometric relationships in that abstract world of physical entities that has standalone existence. So the forms of the world are the same as the forms we perceive. But even that is now, I don't want to use the word debunked because I don't like the word, but it's contradicted by our understanding of perception. It assumes very naively that perception is a kind of transparent window that we have into the world. So we can see the forms of the world as they are in themselves. But we know now that that cannot possibly be the case. There are at least two completely independent lines of thinking that tell us that that cannot be the case. Number one is entropy. If we were to mirror the states of the world in our inner perceptual states, there would be no upper bound to the diversity of our perceptual states, because they mirror what is out there in the world, and we do not know whether there is an upper bound in the states of the world. That means that we could not control or cap our inner entropy, and we would basically dissolve into hot soup. So seeing the world, if perception mirrored the states of the world in order to capture the actual forms of the world, seeing the world would be deadly. It would be like seeing the Gorgon, except that instead of turning into stone, we would turn into hot soup. We would die just by seeing the world.
You mean because the world is too complicated according to the materialist worldview itself? There's too much data out there, too much diversity of data? I mean, the world is not entirely entropic. There is, well, actually, you would say it's not out there, but I mean, we think of it as having structure and order. We don't think of the physicalist view of the world isn't that it's all soup out there. It's that actually, no, there is structure and order. There are the walls.
The statement is not that the world has infinite entropy. The statement is that a living being, which is a tiny subset of the world, if that living being were to mirror the variety of states of the world, then it could not maintain its structural integrity, because a living being is a tiny subset of the world. What we would be asked to do is to imagine that a tiny subset of a superset, that tiny subset could contain as much information as the superset it is a part of. That doesn't work. Or at least there would be no guarantee that we would survive.
But I think the standard response from evolutionary biology or evolutionary psychology would be, well, yeah. I mean, the kinds of organisms that survive in natural selection are the kind that are good at filtering out a whole lot of information so they can focus on the critical information, right?
Even then, we are too tiny. Okay, I'm not making and that's not what the studies show. I'm not making a categorical statement that we would necessarily die. The point is, we would have no control over whether we would die or not by seeing the world. Now, when we say that the world has limited entropy, you have to remember that the world we are talking about is already what is perceived. So the entropy is already filtered out by hypothesis, because you're talking about the world as you perceive. What is naive is to say that you perceive the world, the forms of the world as they are in themselves, because then there would be no structural upper bound on our internal entropy. And then, at least statistically speaking, some of us would have to die just by looking at the world if you looked wrongly at the world. Now, we know that's not the case. So perception is not a transparent windscreen into the world. Perception is a dashboard of dials. We are pilots of an airplane and we are flying by instrument. Our sense organs are the sensors of the airplane, measuring relevant, salient things about the world outside. And the results of those measurements are presented on a dashboard of dials that tell us accurate, important information about the world. And that's what perception is. It's the dashboard.
Okay.
We do not have a transparent windscreen to see the world as it is in itself.
Right.
All we have is the dials showing what's measured about the world. And evolution gave us a good enough dashboard to survive. We can fly by instruments. We can land safely without seeing what's actually out there. And that dashboard limits the entropy because the dials have certain limited scales and they capture what's salient for your survival. But they don't give you an unbound entropic view into the world as it is in itself.
But I think all that a lot of evolutionary biologists would agree with, or psychologists or something, right? I mean, that doesn't sound radical to me.
It's not radical at all. In fact, evolution, as Professor Donald Hoffman has been saying in recent years, evolution doesn't favor perceiving the world as it is. Evolution favors perceiving the world in whatever way is best to increase your chances of survival.
I've had him on the show, and I mean, with all due respect, that itself is far from an original observation on his part. I mean, evolutionary psychology has emphasized that in what he would consider trivial and mundane ways, that is the case. I mean, just to give you a simple example, we overestimate the speed of approaching objects, presumably because it's better to get out of the way too soon than to get out of the way too late, right? Now, that is not a metaphysically significant illustration of the fact that our brains are not necessarily designed to perceive the world accurately, but the principle is long and well established in evolutionary psychology that what evolution preserves is kinds of perceptions that are conducive to the replication of the genes, and period. And that often corresponds, they would say, to an accurate view of the world. But if it doesn't, then accuracy loses out. So that's not new. Now Hoffman, I was going to ask you about the connection between your worldview and Hoffman's. Hoffman is taking that in a metaphysical direction and saying, so there's no reason so you should carry the doubt about whether your perception is yielding a true view of things to a very fundamental level, right? To the question of whether the stuff out there is even stuff. I mean, the metaphor he uses is that, when I look at my computer screen, there's this little trash bin that represents, deleting. It's the place I pull things to delete them. There's all these icons. But of course, the computer's operating system doesn't have icons. Icons are a convenient simplification of aspects of the operating system in a certain sense. And so in this metaphor, the code is closer to being the real world and the icons closer to being what we perceive. Now, I was going to ask you, what is the correspondence between your view and Hoffman's view? Because it seems to me he's still not being an idealist, right?
I think he's outright an idealist. I know Don personally.
Does he say he's an idealist? Does he say he's an idealist?
Conscious agents are mental agents, and he says all that exists are conscious agents. So he's certainly a form of, he endorses a form of idealism.
Okay.
I think you're correct that the basic intuitions behind what he's saying have been around. Plantinga has said something to that effect decades ago. Plantinga.
I said it decades ago. It's really been out there a long time. And I was not original. I was quoting people. But
I think what he did that is important, innovative, and original is that he brought mathematical rigor to this. He applied game theory to this, and he has proven theorems about this. So it's not just an intuition anymore. It's a proven fact that that's what evolution would do. He did that through simulations and through mathematical theorems. So I wouldn't minimize the importance and the originality of what he added to the discussion.
Oh, no. I mean, carrying it in a metaphysical direction is very interesting. But as for illustrating the general fact that the evolved brain will not necessarily give you an accurate view of the world, I ask him flat out, why'd you bother with the simulation? It follows logically from the theory of natural selection. But anyway, we can leave that aside. So would you embrace that, the part of his metaphor I described? It doesn't seem to me you would want to put it the way I put it, because the way I put it is still like, we are the well, we are the agents. We are the kind of well, you tell me. Are you totally happy with that computer metaphor?
Yes, I am. And I think the mistake we tend to make, and that's psychologically very, very understandable, is that we don't dare draw the full range of implications that certain realizations, certain scientific facts have. We tend to be cautious about how far we draw the implications because we want to hold on to the current narrative we have about what's going on. Otherwise, we would be sort of, free falling. We wouldn't. We would feel disconnected to everything that has given us a certain sense of control about the game we are playing. So the implications of research done by, for instance, Carl Friston in the UK and Donald Hoffman in the US, people draw only very mild implications from that. Like they explain why when you have a rotating mask, why the back of the mask is perceived as the same as the front of the mask, because we sort of infer faces, and faces are protruding out. That's why we see the inner side of the mask as if it were protruding out as well, when in fact it's the opposite that's going on. Or just as you said, we overestimate the speed of objects coming to us, but we think they're still objects, and we think they still have the geometrical relationships that they seem to have. And we think there are still masks. Even if we see them wrongly, they are still masks, and some geometrical relationships are still preserved. And we don't realize that if these two gentlemen, amongst many others, if what they've proven mathematically, Carl Friston has proven the inferential mind mathematically as well. It's very difficult to follow the proof, but if you spend a couple of days on it, you convince yourself that he is right. The true implications of that, if we acknowledge those implications without bias, without trying to stick to some form of what we already believed, you realize that the implications go much further than what people admit. And I think the merit of Don, Carl, I still haven't seen him biting that bullet all the way, but the merit of Don is that he was impartial and objective enough to say, okay, if what I've proven is true, then there are more things I have to abandon about my belief systems than just the part that I'm comfortable to abandon. Then I really have, what I really have is a sort of a desktop and not a view of the world as it is in itself. I only have a desktop representation because that's what the mathematics and the theory is telling me. And that's what the experiments are telling me. And the same with Carl Friston and the idea that perception fundamentally limits entropy by encoding and turning perception into an inferential encoded process, as opposed to a mirror of the states of the world. The implication is that even what we call a brain has now to be taken with a whole bag of salt. There may not be such a thing as a brain with the shapes that we perceive. The brain in perception is a representation of something that really does exist, is really out there. It's for real. It doesn't depend on us. It doesn't depend on whether we believe it or not, whether we like it or not. It's really out there. And it does look like a brain when we perceive, but the thing in and of itself, if you could peek through a transparent window as opposed to looking at the dashboard only, the thing in itself probably doesn't look at all like a brain. It's something totally incommensurable with a brain. So if you believe these theoretical implications, there is no middle ground. Sorry, if you believe these theoretical conclusions and proofs, there is no middle ground. You cannot abandon only 10% of your belief system. You have to be objective, impartial, and see what the full range of implications are. And I think Don has been very courageous in doing that. And I take my hat off to him.
Let me ask you another version of the question, well, an extension of the question I asked you about the appeal of a materialist account of natural selection. Like it makes sense all the way up, right? From strand of replicating physical information to human beings. Let me put it this way. I guess people might say, okay, you're saying that's not what's fundamental. The brain is not what's fundamental. What's fundamental is consciousness, and the body is not what's fundamental. What's fundamental is consciousness, and what you're calling the brain and the body are mere, kind of surface manifestations of that consciousness as perceived from other kind of realms, kind of dissociated realms of consciousness or something. I guess the question might arise like, well, okay, first of all, I mean, again, it is a little harder for me to conceive of, so something is changing in consciousness as evolution happens, right? Something about the structure of consciousness is changing as evolution happens. And again, from the point of view of materialists, it seems like kind of vague and mushy and something that's hard to think about. But in any event, it's kind of interesting. You would say, I presume, that consciousness is evolving in accordance with some kind of laws, I guess. But if you said that, it sounds like you're about getting ready to tell me you wouldn't put it quite like that. But in any event, let me. I mean, just judging by your positioning of your repositioning of the surface manifestation of your consciousness, otherwise known as your body. Let me just say that I guess the materialists would say, well, okay, even granted that there's some explanation for why consciousness is moving in this form that entails these ever more elaborate physical structures. Isn't it kind of a weird coincidence that that the narrative at the physicalist, materialist level kind of works so well, so to speak, on its own terms? You know what I mean? It's like
it doesn't.
It's like, well, no, it does. I mean, now look. Let me say something. I'm totally open-minded on consciousness because I don't think anybody has a satisfactory explanation. Okay, I don't mean that evolution does a good job of explaining consciousness.
No,
I
it
don't.
does.
Well, your version of evolution, but what I mean is, when I say I don't think there's a satisfactory view of consciousness, what I mean is, okay, there's the epiphenomenalist view, which is intuitively appealing to me, which is the idea that consciousness has the relationship to your body that the shadow of my hand has to my hand. In other words, the real action is the hand. The shadow is just a shadow. It doesn't affect anything. It is affected by the physical, doesn't affect anything. Okay, epiphenomenalism makes sense to me, but an epiphenomenalist then has to explain what consciousness is for, because certainly until the advent of human beings who talk about consciousness, who talk about subjective states, it was having no function. It was by definition having no function. So that's kind of unsatisfactory. And then all the other things, interactive dualism, a limited, whatever they call it, whatever the Dan Dennett's calls his thing, which is totally unintelligible to me.
Illusionism.
Well, that's his latest version, but it's basically
eliminativism.
Eliminativism, right? So I just want to say, I'm very open-minded, and I am not ruling out your view precisely because I don't think anyone has solved the problem. But that said, I do think natural selection, if you just leave out the subjective experience part and don't ask it to explain that, but just ask it to explain the physical structure of us and how we came to be, it is a really powerful explanation that works really well on its own terms. And I'm just saying, like, I'm like, well, isn't it kind of a hell of a coincidence that you're saying the physical level isn't where the real action is, and yet it's such a good narrative. It's such a compelling theory, right? You know what I mean?
You are seeing contradictions where there are none. So bear with me. There is a lot to unpack here. The explanatory power of scientific models is what we have to credit with success. That's what works. Evolution by natural selection, I would go as far, I know many would disagree with me, but come on, it is bloody proven. We know it happens. There are even experiments with bacteria that you can run a large evolutionary chain. Some might say, well, you don't get really speciation. Yes, but we can compare the genetic codes of different organisms, and we clearly see an evolutionary tree. We know that species arise from other species through the accrual of genetic mutation. This is a very powerful explanatory account of the structure of life. Do I deny that? Not at all. I subscribe to evolution. I don't think the mutations are random. And actually, since the last 2 years, we have now compelling evidence that the mutations are not random, that they are biased. We don't know yet why that is the case, or how that can be the case. But
there
we know
are
that
Darwinian explanations as to how it could come to be the case, but in the so-called evolution of evolvability. But go ahead.
Okay. So is there doubt that this explanatory account is successful, that this account for how the evolution, how the structure of life, complex structure of life has come to be is successful? No, there is no doubt at all about the success of this account.
Mm-hmm.
Should we credit this to materialism? No, materialism is a metaphysics.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an explanatory scientific model. It's not predicting the configurations of nature. It's telling you tentatively what nature is, not what it does.
Mm-hmm.
What it does is the scientific account. How did nature do us? How did nature do our structure? There is a scientific account for that called evolution that it's almost, well, I would go so far as to say it's certainly true, but okay, it's almost certainly true. And the credit for that goes to science, not to materialism as a metaphysics. Right. Materialism in the minds of scientists is a working hypothesis that allows them to have a relationship with the subject of their studies. It's a way of thinking about nature. It is not a scientific model. It's a way of thinking about things. Idealism is as compatible with evolution as materialism, because idealism would say, okay, the first alter, in other words, abiogenesis, the first living being that arose from non-living things, that remains a mystery under idealism, just as it is under materialism. And whatever account materialism would have for that, whatever account science would have for that, idealism would almost certainly be compatible with that. But that initial alter was very simple dissociated mentation. Why did that very simple dissociated mentation eventually turn into very complex dissociated mentation, like us with our higher level mental functions, metacognition, explicit introspection, all that stuff we have? Well, because the alters along the history of life on this planet for 3.5, 4 billion years, they have to react to environmental pressures. And it was that need, the pressure of natural selection, that has led to more complex alters that could stay alters for longer, more effectively. In other words, that could survive and reproduce. So you're giving credit to materialism, which is a metaphysics, when you should be giving credit to science, which fundamentally is agnostic of metaphysics.
Yeah, I mean, I accept that. I guess what you might say is that I'm trapped in a dualistic framework, and that's the underlying fallacy in my question, right? Like, I insist on seeing an outer and an inner, and asking you, why do the two correspond? And
because one is the appearance of the other.
You're saying because the outer is the appearance of the inner.
Exactly. So substance dualism is a very, let me put it mildly, it's a very difficult thing to defend.
Do you want to define that to people, for people, just in case substance dualism being mainly kind of what we think about as dualism. Consciousness is this stuff, material stuff is this stuff, and then they have some kind of relationship. Is that what you mean by substance dualism?
Okay. Substance dualism is the idea that there are at least two types of existence in nature that are totally incommensurable with one another. So there is res extensa. Okay, there is extended stuff or matter, physical stuff, and then there is soul stuff, which is not physical at all. And these two are fundamentally independent of one another, but they interact in some way. Now, this idea is extraordinarily difficult to defend, and I think we have no reason to take it seriously. But there is another form of dualism that is not substance dualism. It's a different kind of dualism. There are many dualisms in nature, past and future, here and there. There are all kinds of dualisms if nature is extended. This is another form of dualism, the inner and outer. There is the inner conscious experience, and there is what that inner conscious experience looks like when observed from the outside, which is also a conscious experience. So that kind of dualism exists, but you're correct that we insist on thinking in dualistic terms in the substance sense. For instance, when I tell people that everything is mind, people rush to tell me that, well, no, if you are undergoing brain surgery and the surgeon stimulates your brain here and there, that causally leads to a conscious effect. You experience something because the neurosurgeon was poking around your brain. So that's an instance of material causation. So matter has to precede experience because a material process caused an experience. Well, they are presupposing dualism, while idealism is not dualism. They are thinking of the surgeon's electric probe that pokes around your brain as something outside consciousness. Mm-hmm. While under idealism, the probe is also what a transpersonal mental process looks like. And that transpersonal mental process impinges on a personal mental process, namely your inner experience, leading to an effect. Now, that one type of mental process causes an effect in another type of mental process is trivial. Our thoughts leads to changes in our emotions. And the other way around, all the time. Mental processes of different kinds causally interact with one another, leading to mental effects. And there is nothing mysterious about this. So the alcohol you drink that changes your inner life, the guy who punches you in the head and changes your conscious inner life, or the surgeon that goes poking around your brain and changes your conscious inner life, the surgeon with the probe, the alcohol, the pill you swallow with a psychedelic, all these things too are images of transpersonal mental processes that interfere with the mental processes going on within your dissociative boundary. Some mental process on the outside interfering.
It seems like there's kind of two different things going on. I mean, when the guy punches you in your the face, I can see you saying that's just your consciousness bumping into his, or your realm of your little chunk of the universal consciousness bumping into his little chunk of the universal consciousness. But when I take a drug, I mean, the drug is, you're not saying the drug is, or are you saying the drug itself, you would say, is a manifestation of the universal consciousness?
The drug is what a certain mental process in the mind of nature, if you will, looks like. In the same way that if somebody takes a brain scan of your brain activity right now, there will be pockets of activity here and there in different places, different mental processes going on in your brain. The pill that you take is just like one of those mental processes in the mind of nature. And if you swallow it, of course, that mental process will interfere with your personal mental processes, leading to a mental effect. It's all mentation, but there is an inner and an outer, and all the causal chains that we have modeled through science still hold. What is the alternative, Robert? The alternative is materialism. It's telling you that the pill you see doesn't exist. It's engendered by your brain. It is epiphenomenal. But there is something out there that corresponds to the pill, and that something is purely abstract. Now, if you're talking about things that are vague and mushy, materialism is a lot more vague and mushy because it doesn't even tell you what the pill is. It's pure abstraction. While idealism is telling you, well, it's what a mental process looks like.
Okay, well,
that's much more concrete.
But there are kind of two different things here in terms of what materialism tells you the pill is like. Intuitive, what you would call naive materialism, just tells you, no, it's a physical pill. That it makes total sense. It's like the wall. There's this physical stuff. Maybe what you mean is that science is now telling us that at the bottom of the physical world, it's all abstraction. We never find the physical stuff. It's like particles have subatomic particles. What do those have? What are they? Are they particles? Are they waves? Well, I don't know. There's these convenient abstractions, right? I mean, are you saying that science is telling the scientific description of the physical world boils down to abstractions? Because I think the average person's intuitive apprehension of the physical world doesn't run into that problem. It's just physical. It's material. It's hard.
It does. Okay. No, I'm not saying that science is the thing doing it. Science is agnostic of what the world is. The theoretical entities that arise from scientific investigation are convenient fictions. In other words, nature behaves as though those convenient fictions were true. But throughout the history of science, we have changed those convenient fictions because science is not married to a narrative about what the world is. Science is only interested in what the world does, how nature behaves.
Right.
So Newton had this convenient fiction of gravity being a force that acts instantaneously at a distance. It took the French 50 years to stop laughing of Newton because that sounded like magic woo-woo. Instantaneous invisible forces acting at a distance. What the hell is that?
Einstein had the same view of it.
He
spooky
changed,
action at a distance.
No. Einstein, when it comes to gravity, Einstein is the one who showed that Newton's convenient fiction was no longer convenient based on what we knew.
That's what I mean.
He
viewed Newtonian's conceptions of gravity as, quote, spooky action at a distance, right?
No. Spooky action at a distance was applied to quantum entanglement. That came much later. That was in the 1920s. So that's something else. No. What Einstein showed is that Newton's convenient fiction of an invisible force acting at a distance couldn't account for certain observations. For instance, the orbit of Mercury and certain things that were going on, the photoelectric effects. So he replaced that convenient fiction. Instead of saying that nature behaves as though an invisible force acting at a distance existed, nature behaves as though space and time is a fabric that can be bent and twisted. So that's our current convenient fiction.
And then the causality is happening via proximity, via direct kind of contact in a certain sense.
The causality happens because mass bends the fabric, the invisible fabric of space-time.
What I meant was Einstein found the idea of spooky action. We don't need to get off on this much, but Einstein found notions of spooky action at a distance implausible. He solved that problem with gravity and wanted to rule it out at the quantum level by saying that entanglement wouldn't happen. And we now think he was wrong about that. In a certain sense.
That's a whole, and we should.
Let's not get into that. I mean, there may be a version of quantum physics we want to get into if we have time. But let me
try to answer your previous question, because I was still trying to get there. So science is about nature's behavior and convenient fictions. And those convenient fictions are convenient because nature seems to behave as though they existed, but there is no fundamental scientific commitment to the fictions. For instance, we now found the Higgs boson. Do you know what the Higgs boson is? The Higgs boson is a bump on an energy histogram. The Higgs boson as a particle is a convenient fiction too. We never measure the Higgs boson directly. It decays before it interacts with measurement surfaces. Right. What we measure is what it decays into. It's the footprints of the Higgs. But it is very convenient to imagine that there is a little particle that we call the Higgs boson because nature behaves as though it existed.
Right, I agree.
The problem is not a scientific problem. The problem that you're alluding to, how the narrative that the pill really exists as a physical object, that's not a scientific problem. That's a metaphysical problem of materialism. But imagine that the pill is white. We tend to think that under materialism, a white pill really exists out there. But it doesn't, because materialism says the whiteness is created by your brain inside your skull. It's one of the qualities of experience, and the brain generates experience. So there is no white pill out there. What is out there is pure abstraction. Under idealism, there is also no real white pill out there, because the white pill is what's displayed on your dashboard, and your dashboard is in your personal mind within your dissociative boundary. But there is a mental process out there that corresponds to the white pill. There is a mental process whose image on the dashboard is a white pill. And that's much more concrete than the pure abstraction of physicalism. So as far as mushiness and vagueness goes, materialism takes the crown here by a large margin.
Okay, let me approach this from a different angle. And this is maybe useful for people who want to doubt your claim that your worldview is entirely compatible with science. I'm not like an historian of philosophy by any means, but I think there's an interesting thing about, the so-called empiricists, right? The British empiricists, and so on, like David Hume. I think the first few things you hear about them might lead you to think of them as very kind of hard-nosed scientific, and they are, that's true. But because they were saying, one thing I think empiricists, there's a version of empiricism that says, look, we have to confine our discussion to what we can really see, like what we can really observe. All we have to work with is what we can see, what's out there. Don't get too like mystical with me. Let's just focus on kind of the facts. But really, Hume, for example, was much more epistemically humble, you might say, than that suggests. In the sense, I mean, for example, he was skeptical of our conception of causality itself. Okay, that's an example. But the point I want to make is, if you really start out saying, look, all we have access to is our perceptions of the world, that does naturally lead you to, and has led some empiricists to, I think, a kind of radical doubt about the world out there, right? Because you realize, I don't know if this is making sense, but I mean, it may to you, but I don't know if it's making sense to anybody else. If it is, you realize that, all you know, I mean, it's kind of a Cartesian kind of doubt. It's like, all you know is what the world seems like to you. Those are the only facts you have access to. You will never have direct facts about the world, quote, out there, because all you know, even in the kind of, you might say, materialist description of perception, is what's impinging. Well, you don't even know what's impinging on you. You know what it feels like to be this thing that stuff is impinging on, right? I mean, do you want to say anything about the empiricists?
Yeah.
And,
But I consider myself an extreme empiricist.
That's my point. That's my point. Yeah.
I also subscribe extremely, maybe unreasonably, to Occam's razor, the idea that the best theories are the parsimonious ones. And that's why I'm an idealist, because nature's given, the only thing that nature gives you as a fact is the existence of mental stuff. That's what you have when you're a 5-year-old kid before you start theorizing and telling yourself other things. That's what you have when you're born. It's mental stuff. Your perceptions are mental stuff. They have qualities, colors, flavors. This is mental stuff. It's not physical stuff. This is the stuff that is supposed to be generated by your brain under materialism. But what we are given is mental stuff. Anything else is a theory, is a guess. So from that perspective, I am with the British empiricists. If you want me to speak a little more specifically about David Hume, Hume said that even the mind is not empirically given, because all we have is mental processes. It's particular experiences. It's that thought, it's that pain, it's that red. But the mind underlying it doesn't exist. And of course, what he meant, because that was the context of his time, is that there isn't such a thing as a soul, some kind of gaseous substance that floats from one body to another or whatever, that inhabits a body. Yeah, that stuff is not available to empirical experience indeed. But mentation as a kind of existence, as an ontological category, to speak technically, that is a given. There may not be a discrete soul, but mind stuff exists because any experience is an instance thereof. Now, how far can we take our empirical skepticism? Well, the most extreme position is solipsism, which is the only thing I know to exist is my personal experience. Everything else is a fiction. Therefore, all reality is my personal dream. And the other people I see in my life, they are creations of my own mind. There is nothing it is like to be other people. They exist only insofar as the images I engender and perceive, because my mind is creating them in a form of cosmic personal dream. Now, do I think that is reasonable? No, I think that's completely unreasonable. As Russell said, not even solipsists act consistently with the view that they subscribe to. Imagine a conference of solipsists, like Alan Watts once joked. A conference of people who think they are the only thing that exists and all the other people are in their imagination. If you are a consistent solipsist, you don't even talk about solipsism, because everything is just in the creations of your mind. I think if we are reasonable, we cannot avoid the inference that there is a world outside our minds, a world that we do not have direct access to through personal mentation, a world that we need to infer and try to accumulate knowledge through empirical and theoretical inference. And then the question is, what is the most parsimonious inferences that we can make? What are the most explanatorily powerful inferences we can make? The most empirically adequate, the most internally consistent inferences we can make about what that external world is. And I would submit to you that on all of the enlightenment values, parsimony, internal consistency, empirical adequacy, and so on and so forth, idealism wins them all. Because mentation is the kind of stuff that is given. So if there is a world outside me, then it's most reasonable and parsimonious to say it's just more mentation. It's not my mentation, but it's more of the same kind.
So you mean mentation is the only thing we can be sure exists? That's the only thing we observe directly. It's right. It's like that's kind of what I am. I mean, subjective experience, I can confidently assert exists, but beyond that, there's nothing we can say with confidence. So you're saying it's in a sense, the simplest assumption is that that's all there is, kind of?
That's the most skeptical. The most skeptical idea is solipsism. Is that all that exists is your mentation?
I didn't mean that. What I meant, I meant is the appeal of your worldview, not solipsism, but idealism, and your version of idealism that I can. It doesn't cause me to assume the existence of anything that's fundamentally different from what I know for sure exists. Correct. I know for sure subjective experience exists. I know for sure consciousness exists. And the appeal of your worldview is I don't have to posit the existence of wholly new metaphysical categories.
Correct. It's just more of the same stuff that exists. Uh-huh. So the idealist says, I can see the earth until the horizon. In other words, my personal mentation in the metaphor. But I acknowledge that the earth continues beyond the horizon. But then I would say beyond the horizon is just more earth. It's more of the same kind of stuff that I can directly be acquainted with. Mm-hmm. The materialist will say until the horizon, it's mentation. Beyond the horizon, it's not the earth anymore. It's something totally else. I think that violates parsimony. This would be materialism would be more reasonable if we could not make sense of the facts by extrapolating mentation. If that were impossible, then you're justified in making an extra inference, postulating more theoretical entities. But I would argue, and that's what I've been doing for the past 15 years, that you don't need that. More mentation does the job, especially given the empirical reality of dissociation as a psychiatric phenomenon in mind that we have for the past 20 years or so, a kind of certainty and understanding we didn't have in the 20th century. So I think under Occam's razor, idealism is better. In terms of explanatory power, idealism is better because what materialism does, it postulates this extra entity, matter outside and independent of mentation, and then tries to reduce mentation to it and fails. Mm-hmm. That's the hard problem of consciousness. What idealism says is, well, beyond the horizon, it's more mentation. And mentation is the ontological primitive. You cannot reduce one thing to another or explain one thing in terms of another forever. At some point, you hit rock bottom. The game is, can you explain everything else in terms of that one thing? And idealism, I think, succeeds in explaining everything else, all the dynamics of nature in terms of mind. So it doesn't need to reduce mind. Materialism tries to reduce all of nature to matter and then fails to reduce experience to matter, which is, in a sense, all we have. All we have is experience. Otherwise, it's just nothing. What we don't experience might as well not exist. So in terms of explanatory power, materialism fails. Materialism fails empirical adequacy. The experimental confirmation of Bell's and Leggett's inequalities in quantum physics refute the idea that physical entities have standalone existence, unless you are entertaining the fantasies of superdeterminism or the many worlds interpretation, all of this ridiculous stuff that's gaining some level of plausibility today. It's the scientific woo-woo that you see around. If you don't want to go that way, the way of fantasy, then I would say foundations of physics have now refuted the standalone existence of physical stuff. So physical stuff cannot be primary. So materialism is inadequate when it comes to empirical data as well. And I could go on and so forth, go on and on. Materialism is internally inconsistent. It defines matter as that which has nothing to do with experience. And then it tries to reduce experience to matter. It's like, what? Why are you trying to do that? Materialism mistakes descriptions for the things in themselves.
Well,
the numbers that we define matter in terms of mass, charge, momentum, amplitude, frequency, those numbers are descriptions of experiences. But then materialism says, all that exists is a description.
Well,
the experience comes out of that, like pulling the territory out of the map.
I mean, certainly eliminative materialism is probably subject to that criticism. I think of there being a version of materialism that just says, look, I don't know, consciousness is an unsolved problem. But I know that when I imagine the world out there as being this physical stuff, I get good results. Now, you would say you don't need to think of it as material to do good science. And that's just a mistaken conflation on people's part. But I'm sure this is a reaction you get. And I'd have to think more about whose side I'm on in that argument, because I haven't thought about it before. But you alluded to quantum physics when you brought up many worlds. And many worlds is one way of responding to an issue that arises in quantum physics, and a kind of experimental, I'm not a physicist any more than I'm a philosopher, but the basic idea I gather is that, there is reason to believe that in quantum physics, there is this so-called collapse of the wave function, right? Like if you ask, well, where is this subatomic particle, or what is its velocity or something? A common answer from quantum physics is that, well, there is no definite answer right now. All we can say is that there's a probability that it has this position or velocity. There's this probability that it has this one. Now, if you measure it, you will get a definite answer at that point. But you shouldn't be so naive as to think that was the answer before you measured it, right? I mean, this is what quantum physicists tell us. And I think the many worlds interpretation is a way of saying, well, in your world, when you measured it, it collapsed onto this answer. But at the same point, some other world was created where the answer was that or something. Anyway, many worlds is one response to this problem. Now, do you think that your worldview has a more satisfactory accommodation of this whole problem with the wave so-called collapsing upon measurement?
There's a lot to unpack here, so bear with me. Let's start from the basics so people can follow what we're going to be talking about. The problem is the following. In quantum physics, we have two different processes. One is linear and deterministic. The other one is nonlinear and appears to be non-deterministic. The well-known one is called Schrödinger's equation, or the wave function. We understand that very well. Empirically, we know that nature behaves exactly as predicted by the wave function. The problem is that the wave function only tells us probabilities. If you make a measurement, it will tell you the probability of finding A, B, or C upon measurement. But it doesn't tell you exactly what will appear upon measurement. It just gives you probabilities. And those probabilities spread out in space and across time in a very well understood linear way. We can compute the probabilities of anything being observed anywhere in space or in time if we have the appropriate wave function. And theoretically, there is no reason why we shouldn't have the appropriate wave function. It may be in practice too complex many times, but there is no theoretical reason why it shouldn't be in principle available. The problem is the next process. That's the observation problem, the measurement problem in physics, which is once you make a measurement, you don't get a probability, you get a definite result. So if you throw a coin, you can calculate the probabilities that it will be heads or tail as 50-50%. 50% for one, 50% of the other. But when you measure, it will be either heads or tails, not half heads and half tails. And that is the measurement problem. Now, some people including some very well-known physicists like Sean Carroll, they conflate the notion of parsimony, which is a non-tech notion. We have to be parsimonious about what we think really exists out there. Now, we shouldn't postulate that there is a flying spaghetti monster moving the celestial bodies around their orbits, because we don't need to postulate that. We can make sense of that by postulating less. So that's Occam's razor, the principle of parsimony about what exists in nature. But some physicists, they conflate this principle with epistemic parsimony. And they say, well, because I understand the wave function and I don't understand the measurement function, the problem of the measurement problem of the collapse of the wave function, which is popular metaphor, I will then say that the collapse doesn't exist, and that everything in the envelope of probabilities of the wave function actually exists. And that's more parsimonious, because then I stick to only the equation I know, and the part I don't know, I say it doesn't exist. That's epistemic parsimony, but ontically speaking, it's the least parsimonious thing you can ever conceive, because you're basically saying that everything that can happen actually does happen in some of gazillion parallel universes that pop out of nothing for no reason, every infinitesimal fraction of a second, for which we have precisely zero empirical evidence, because you want to restrict what nature is based on what you know. It's like looking for your lost car keys under the light, even though you don't have any reason to think you lost your car keys there, just because you can see there. I mean, this is ridiculous. It's such a logical fallacy to think that nature should conform to the limitations of our knowledge, and to do that by saying that nature basically does everything that can possibly happen given the limitations of our knowledge about what actually happens or doesn't. It's just ridiculous. So that's how the many worlds interpretation arises. It's a misunderstanding of the concept of parsimony, applying it to our knowledge as opposed to applying it to nature. And it ends up reversing the value of parsimony. The many worlds interpretation is the least parsimonious thought that can ever be conceived by a coherent human mind, to say that everything that can happen actually does.
Now, there is, can I just interject, even among physicists, there's the going way back. I'm not sure if Eugene Wigner was one of these. Maybe I'm getting him mixed up with somebody else, but there have been physicists going way back who said, the reason that you get a definite measurement when you measure is that the observer, the conscious observer, is kind of forcing reality to assume definite form. So there have been people who, now again, this still remains a kind of dualistic framework maybe from your point of view, but there have been people who suggested that consciousness actually plays some kind of a forceful role in bringing reality into existence, right? Now, you're not exactly that view probably, but you probably find it more interesting than many worlds.
It's motivated by a legitimate observation, but I think it runs too far with.
Okay.
No, because it grants consciousness. Look, that's Wigner's interpretation, or the consciousness causes collapse interpretation, which was motivated by the mathematical work done by John von Neumann. And John von Neumann said that whatever material entities interact, they don't perform a measurement, they just become entangled. So when you bring a measurement apparatus to a quantum system and perform a measurement, that requires an interaction between the measurement apparatus and the thing you're measuring. And upon interaction, they would just become entangled with each other, and there will be no collapse. Well, but we observe a definite answer, not waves of murky probabilities. So, but every time you draw that equation further, you have more and more and more entanglement, all the way into the retinas of our eyes, which are also material things, that they too should become entangled. Therefore, only consciousness can cause collapse. That's the motivation for Wigner's interpretation. I think what this shows us is not that consciousness magically changes the state of a world outside consciousness. That is like granting phenomenal superpowers to a restricted view of consciousness. What it is telling us is that there is no world outside of consciousness, and that the wave function is epistemic. It's the sum total of our knowledge about that world in a transpersonal form of subjectivity. It's the best description we can make about what those transpersonal mental processes will be doing, how they will be behaving. But we are not at a point yet to say what particular reality will be registered as a mental process upon the interaction of a dissociated alter of consciousness and the non-dissociated transpersonal mental processes out there. So it's a question of knowledge, not a question of reality, in my view. But the most interesting part of this whole discussion, which transcends all the many worlds discussion, is the following. When you do have two entangled particles and you perform a measurement on one, say particle A.
And maybe we should say that entangled, as I understand entanglement, it's like you have these two particles, they're together, but even if you separate them and they start flying apart, they continue to have a relationship that it's not just because they were in the same state at the beginning, and so naturally they change at the same rate and so remain in sync in that sense. There's something maybe we needn't get into because it's so subtle, but it amounts to, in some sense, I think you could say, influence happening across distance instantaneously in some sense, or anyway, we don't just mean entanglement in a really trivial, mundane sense. There is this concept in physics that seems pretty weird. But go ahead.
So entanglement means that you cannot describe the behavior of one particle independently of the behavior of the other. Their behaviors are entangled, even though they are separate across the fabric of space-time. They are not in the same place. They are far away. Actually, experiments have been done now in which they are 10 kilometers apart. So they are entangled in a technical sense. They are not physically together, but their behavior is such that you cannot describe what one will do independently of what the other does. What they do depends on what the other does. And that's entanglement. So if you take one of these entangled particles, say A, and have Alice perform a measurement on particle A, and Bob performs a measurement on particle B at the same time as Alice does, but far away, on the other side of the planet, the other side of the universe, what you will see is that what Alice chooses to measure about particle A will determine, or it will directly influence what Bob sees when he measures particle B. Alice's choice instantaneously influences what Bob sees on his particle. Now, what Alice chooses to observe is a certain physical property, and particles are defined in terms of their physical properties. In other words, a particle is the sum total of its physical properties. So if Alice's choice of what to see defines what particle B is, what Alice chooses to measure about particle A changes what particle B is, then we cannot say that particle A and B as physical entities existed before measurement, because it's the measurement Alice does that determines what particle B on the other side of the universe is. And what this tells us is that physical properties, in other words, what defines physicality, materiality, they do not have standalone existence. They didn't exist prior to measurement. They are the appearance of a deeper layer of reality that presents itself to measurement in the form of what we call physicality. But physicality, because it's the appearance upon measurement of a deeper layer of reality, physicality doesn't exist prior to measurement. Of course not. It's for the same reason that if you're looking at the dashboard of an airplane, but you turn off the sensors, you will see nothing on the dashboard. The dials will show you nothing. No measurements being performed. The dashboard shows nothing. That doesn't mean that the world out there doesn't exist. Of course it does. It's just not the dashboard. It's the thing that is measured in order to be displayed on the dashboard. So what these experiments are telling us is that the world as it is in itself, the thing measured, is not physical. Physicality is what appears on the dashboard upon measurement. And it correlates reliably with the world as it is in itself, in the same sense that the dials on the cockpit of an airplane give you accurate information about what's going on outside, enough that you can fly safely by instruments alone.
Mm-hmm.
But we should not say that the world is the dashboard.
Yeah.
That's stupid. It's silly. You're mistaking the whole thing. The world is not physical for the same reason that it is not the dashboard. And that's why physical properties don't exist until you measure. There's nothing on the dashboard until your sensor makes a measurement. That doesn't mean that there is no world, that there is nothing being measured. Of course there is. It's just not physical. It's a deeper layer of reality.
Let me ask you, does, there are people who take the phenomenon of entanglement and say, whoa, so that means like it could be that, telepathy is happening, like I'm feeling the thoughts of somebody in China right now, or various weird shit is happening, and physicists say, no, you're going too far. I'm just wondering, does your view of the situation leave more room for weird shit to happen via the kinds of dynamics we see in entanglement?
From a scientific perspective, no. I don't think entanglement in and of itself gives us reason to entertain certain hypotheses, because entanglement, it's a very well-defined kind of thing. Entangled systems don't survive interaction with the environment. The information that is contained in that superposition of states, the entangled state, sort of leaks into the classical environments to the point of not being perceivable anymore. It gets diluted into the environment. We call it decoherence. So it's difficult to appeal to quantum physics alone to justify telepathy. Does that mean that I don't think telepathy can happen? No, I think it can happen, but not because of quantum entanglement. I think telepathy can happen because no process in nature is perfect. Rain never eliminates all air humidity. Fire never burns everything that can be combusted. No process in nature is perfect. So if our individual minds are a dissociative process that prevents us from reading each other's thoughts because we are dissociated from one another, then that dissociation too probably isn't bulletproof. It's probably not completely perfect. There probably is some kind of traffic across the dissociative boundary. It may be, in some sense, things can percolate through it. See what I mean? It's not a completely tight, perfect seal. It's not waterproof. I think there is good reason to think that it is not, and that occasionally one could have felt impressions that are true about something that is happening beyond perceptual range. I have had it. My girlfriend who lives with me, we've been together for 9 years. She regularly has it, and it has.
How does it show up? Like what kinds of things? She says to call somebody and says, "I know what you were just thinking," and she's right.
No, that happens between us all the time.
That happens between you. Well, yeah, but that can happen because you know somebody so well. Right?
No. It happens. Look, I'm critical enough to know that sometimes it happens because we were both sort of triggered by the same external event that we were observing, and we made the same cognitive associations to something, and we knew what we were thinking because of that trivial line of cognitive associations. So I know how to filter this stuff out, when you're prompted to a thought together with somebody else, and you think you're reading each other's thoughts, but no, you both independently arrived at that thought because you were prompted by the same external cue. But there are things that I can't dismiss. Can I tell you a story? Is it
totally
okay? There was once a few years ago, we were on holidays in the countryside in Germany. She's from Germany, and we were sort of far away from civilization. That's what we wanted to do. We wanted to be a week really off the grid, and we were far away. And we were away from phone lines. We had our mobile phones, but she was with me all the time. I knew she was not using it. One day in the morning, she wakes up and said, "Wow, I had the weirdest dream." And I was already awake before she woke up. And I asked her, "So what dream?" And then she said, "Well, I dreamed that my grandmother was alive at the time, was in hospital with a bandage in her head, some kind of head injury, and that my two aunts, grandmother's daughters, were with her in the hospital. And my grandmother was telling me mentally that she was okay. And that was just this static picture, nothing happening, just this static picture. The grandmother with a bandaged head and the two sisters in the hospital, and the grandmother suggesting mentally, I am okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I'm a student of Jung, so I sometimes I guess a dream interpretation, but I couldn't place this one because it was so static. And then in a sort of an intuition,
you mean you couldn't interpret it? You couldn't come up with an interpretation of what?
Yeah, because it was static. It was like a picture and a mental impression. I couldn't interpret that. But I was triggered. It's a peculiar dream. Usually in dreams, stuff happens. And then I suggested, don't you want to call your father just to ask for news? And then she sort of got spooked, picked up her phone and called her father. And her father told her the story. Her grandmother had a stroke, had a brain stroke. So she had a brain injury.
Within the last 24 hours or something?
Yeah, just that night, in the wee hours of that night.
Roughly when she was having the dream?
Before, I think, an hour or two before.
Yeah.
And she was in hospital, and her dad's two sisters, her aunts, were there with her grandmother, but the doctor had already said that she was out of the woods, that there was no longer a life risk. And we were floored. Now, I can't make sense of that in classical terms. All I can say is use my own view of reality and think, her grandmother and my girlfriend, their dissociative boundaries was porous. In the wee hours of the morning when you're still sleepy, your dissociative boundary is porous. You don't have that assertion of the ego yet. And something got through. Some mental process got through, bypassed perceptual channels.
Now, what a skeptic would say, of course, is, well, so much stuff happens in the world. There's going to be weird coincidences. And somewhere in the world, when you look at how many people there are and how many dreams there are, it's just going to happen that somebody gets it right. Now, right. So that's what you'd hear. Now, maybe that you have experiences like this with such regularity that we're really kind of pushing. It's kind of pushing, credibility to think that it would be coincidence. Maybe that's your view, but what is your response to questions like that?
I think the criticism you just related, I think it's a lot of the times valid. I would go as far as to say in the massive majority of times, what we see as, spooky things is just stuff that at some point has to happen. Like some people think that it's very special that often they look at the clock when all the digits are the same, like 2222 or 1111, and they think that's some message from some transcendent realm. I don't think so. I think we look at the clock so many times a day that it's bound to happen that every now and then all digits will be the same. So I do take heed from that criticism. I take it seriously. I think it's very valid. But when this stuff happens to you with certain regularity, it does pushes credulity. I mean, Michael Shermer, our common friend, he had one of these experiences happen to him.
Yeah, with his wife. The radio that supposedly wasn't working and suddenly was. And and he, of course, founded the magazine, The Skeptic, and is a skeptic, but he seems to be kind of taking seriously. I mean, apparently that really got his attention. I would say I've never had a dream that worked out like that. And if we're going to look at this scientifically, I have to be part of the database, right? So you have to add that in. So between you and me, we have per person half as many of these weird things as per person as we did before we include me in the database. I don't think my wife has, so that brings it down to a third. You know what I mean? I mean,
yeah.
Now, but your view, I guess your view must be, But, here's the thing I've always wondered. I remember there was this woman, I was at a conference at Esalen once, which is, I don't know if you know about Esalen, but it's, kind of borderline. And there was a woman from some association that I think her name was Marilyn Schlitz or something. And she was a believer in this kind of stuff. But she was telling me things that I thought, well, this should be experimentally verifiable. If there are these special people, like I think she was saying people at music schools, gifted musicians, tend to have certain kinds of kind of paranormal gifts or something. And I thought, like, well, then do the damn experiment. I mean, go get this subgroup of people, do the controlled experiments, and so on. I mean, I take it your view is there are people who have, you might be too humble to call it a gift if you're one of the people, but I take it your view is that there are people who are more susceptible to this kind of experience.
Yeah.
Should it be possible to get them all together and do a bunch of experiments to convince the world?
I think we make some intrinsic assumptions when we talk of experiments. In an experiment, you have to control for the experimental conditions. You have to control for whatever might be influencing the experiment that doesn't belong in the experiment. You have to instrument the participant, put an EEG cap or make skin conduction methods, and you are in a clinical setting. And all those things have a psychological impact on the people participating in the experiment. There is one major thing, as simple as the fact that they are being expected to have this kind of non-ordinary experiences on request at a certain time, at a certain place. And so the very experimental procedure has an effect on the psychology of the participants. When you are doing an experiment on bacteria or on minerals, you don't need to worry about this.
Mm-hmm.
But when you are doing an experiment on people and the desired observation is a cognition of these people, then of course the entire experimental procedure will affect whether you can observe your hypothesis or not. What you see is that, at least anecdotally, I understand that most of these experiences are not prompted. They don't come on demand. They arise because of some kind of emotional dynamics. So they cannot be conjured up into reality on demand. Like, do this now. It doesn't work like that. And in fact, if you put people in an experimental setting, you may be drastically reducing the chance that the thing you want to observe can be observed at all. You will be excluding it merely by controlling the experiment. So I don't think it's experimentally trivial to do what you're saying. It's something that may happen in the world, but not under controlled conditions.
Let me
That's sad. People like Gene Radin. I forget his name.
I think
Dean Radin.
Okay.
People like Dean Radin have done experiments like this, and they have observed the effect. It's small, but it is statistically significant, and I think that's intriguing.
Okay, let me ask you, and I take it, by the way, that things as weird or almost as weird as the story you just described have happened much more than once involving you and your girlfriend or something?
What I told you is the most significant one because of the number of elements. The two sisters, a hospital, a head injury, the timing. It's too much. If you do a calculation of probabilities, given everything she could have dreamed of spontaneously, that the timing and the corrective, it's too much. It's just too much. My skeptical self cannot just dismiss this one.
But anyway, there are other things between you and involving you and or your girlfriend.
Sometimes we have the same thought spontaneously, untriggered by an external situation.
I mean, the reason I ask is because, first of all, it seems to me like your worldview, your view of consciousness makes kind of intuitive sense to you in a way that it obviously doesn't to other people, right? I mean, you have an easier time, clearly seeing this view of consciousness than some people. And I was going to ask two questions. One was, do you think that fact is, you mentioned earlier that at age 9 or 10, you had this epiphany like, whoa, I'm different I'm my own self. Now, and I think most people don't have that intuition. And I was going to ask, did that signify that there's something different about the way you view the world that also accounts for the fact that this view is intuitively clear to you? Are those two things related? But I was also going to say, yeah, go ahead, answer that one.
I don't think I'm special or different in any sense. I think we all share our core humanity. I think I would even go as far as to say that most people had the experience I had when I was 9. It's just that they don't remember. And my set of interests happened to be such that I registered that. I found that peculiar and I stored it. I remember it. But other people would have that, dismiss it the next day and never again remember it. But I don't think I'm special in any sense. Now, I have a worldview that can accommodate certain things that mainstream materialism cannot, which does make my life easier. I don't go wide-eyed, think, oh my God, something supernatural. No, I can accommodate that as a sort of more or less ordinary part of nature. Just
like this dream in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't go like thinking, oh my God, something supernatural happened to my girlfriend. I would tend to regard that as, okay, it's just part of nature. There's nothing extraordinary about this.
Does your worldview make sense to your girlfriend? And the reason I was going to ask that was I was wondering, like, do you think there's a connection between the fact that you think you are more susceptible to these, what, paranormal or whatever you want to call them, experiences, and the fact that your worldview makes sense to you, right? Is it possible that do you think you're kind of in some sense more plugged into your being and your view? Your view is that you're more plugged into reality than the average person. You think your view of consciousness is right and theirs is wrong. So you do think that, is that related to what you see as you're being more susceptible to these weird experiences?
I don't think so. Before I was with my girlfriend, I never witnessed these experiences. Notice that these are not my experiences. They are her experiences. Even when we share a thought, it's usually her. She starts telling me something, and I go my God, I was thinking just about that.
So she's the receiver. You're just the transmitter, kind of.
I am a very hard-headed person. I hear people talk about certain epiphanies and experiences, and I don't have that. My first experiences that were non-ordinary, they were induced by high-dose psychedelics. I had to come to that in my 30s to experience these things that other people were reporting. I'm pretty hard-headed.
But you had this worldview, this view of consciousness before you took the psychedelics.
No. I took the psychedelics as a sort of part of my due diligence. If I were talking about consciousness, I had to understand the possible states of consciousness. I was in my mid-30s when I took psychedelics.
But to be clear, so you're saying you did already or did not already have the view of consciousness we've been discussing here. You had it before the psychedelics. Yeah.
I arrived at my view of consciousness and nature out of logical reasoning and empirical evidence. I didn't come at this through first-person insight, which I'm not proud of. I think I am particularly dumb, or I don't have subtlety in terms of. I don't have that kind of mental subtlety.
How does that show up? Where do you lack subtlety? With appreciating art or something, or what?
That's one. Although I softened myself over the years.
Maybe the psychedelics helped in that.
Definitely. But in my mid-20s, I did not have subtlety of perception, subtlety of appreciation. I did not have any experiences I couldn't account for. The world worked as clockwork as far as I was concerned. Look, my first job in life, I was a scientist at CERN in Switzerland, the big accelerator, when I was 22. It was my dream job, and I got that job 2 days after I graduated. So my sense of wonder didn't come from altered states of consciousness or, anything non-ordinary, any non-ordinary experience. My sense of wonder came from science, and that was enough for me. And back in the day, I thought one of the fashionable physical theories of the 90s, supersymmetry, It was beginning in the 90s, but it was fashionable, just like M theory was fashionable in the 90s. Now it's all about loop quantum gravity, and the standard model has survived and all that. But supersymmetry was, for me, like the expression of highest beauty in nature. And it turned out to have been wrong. It's wrong. We didn't find supersymmetry. So, if I were the same kind of person I was back then, I would be pretty depressed today. But luckily, I evolved. I am less hard-headed now. But I'm not the kind of person that has this kind of spontaneous stuff happening to them.
You mean the kind your girlfriend has, or you just mean like, yeah. So, two closing questions. One can just be yes or no question. It's kind of for my information. It takes us back to the quantum physics. So do you find David Bohm's view of quantum physics appealing? I don't know much about it at all, except that what I do know sounded a little like some things you were saying, but I don't know. So you can just say yes or no if you want.
No, this question cannot be answered with a yes or no, because it depends on which part of David Bohm's work. Bohmian mechanics, which were communicated in two large papers in the early 1950s, Bohmian mechanics, I think, is entirely flawed. Mm-hmm. And I think has been experimentally now categorically refuted in 2018. Not to mention the fact that it's incoherent, it contradicts other parts of physics. So I think he was wrong in that regard. It's a theory he developed together with de Broglie. And de Broglie had already said in his lifetime that he didn't believe his own theory anymore. Bohm is the one that continued with it. And I think even Bohm acknowledged at some point that Bohmian mechanics is going to go nowhere. Mm-hmm. However, his notion of the how did they call it?
The implicate order or wholeness?
The implicate order. Implicate order. There, I think he hits the nail in the head. Yeah. Okay.
I'll do more research to figure out what that is. The closing question is just kind of what you've talked about this a little, but what difference it makes to, like, if I had an epiphany, and again, I don't rule out your view. I don't think there is a satisfactory resolution of the consciousness problem that I'm aware of. And one of my frustrations is how few people appreciate how weird it is. The fact that it is like something, to be anything. And I guess I was going to ask what difference it makes in your life. So if I had a conversion experience or something, and suddenly I really, at an intuitive level, became convinced that you're right, and don't rule it out, but how might my life change? Would I be happier? Yeah. More depressed? Would I be nicer to people? What?
Well, first, I hope you don't need some kind of transcendent experience to endorse idealism. I think you can do that through rational thinking and empirical considerations. But if you were to buy into analytic idealism wholeheartedly, what would happen to you? I don't know. I can only tell you what happened to me. And it's not all roses. On the negative side, I have now fear of death that I didn't have before. When I was at CERN and I was not thinking about philosophy and I was a materialist, not because I thought it through, but because everybody else was, okay, that must be right. Why would I be afraid of death? Death is just the end of the thing that suffers, so there will be no one there to suffer. It's the end of all my problems. It's the end of everything I find bad, all my regrets, all my fears, all my pain, all my suffering. It's the end of it. It's guaranteed to happen. It may take a long time, but you're guaranteed to get out of this shit. That was very comforting. And thinking about this later on, I realized that psychologically, that's one of the big payoffs of materialism. I mean, materialism in the mid-19th century did away with the greatest fear of humanity throughout human history and prehistory, which was the fear of what you would experience after death. In Christian terms, are you going to go to hell? It's the greatest human anxiety throughout history, and we sort of did away with it in the mid-19th century. That was great. Well, now I think that death is the end of my dissociative process. It's not the end of my subjectivity, because my subjectivity is the subjectivity of nature, is what there is. Where is it going to go? It's going to go nowhere, because everything happens in it.
Well, it will dissolve, won't it kind of dissolve into the universal pool of consciousness, like Atman becomes Brahman and so on?
If you want to give it religious language, yes, but it's the reabsorption of the alter in a broader cognitive context.
Yeah.
And the best guess, the best model we have of how that might feel, the best model we have today is the psychedelic experience, because as it turns out, and we've known that for 10 years now, psychedelics vastly reduce brain activity. That is their key effect. They reduce brain activity. You're tripping out of your head, but your brain is half dead. And since death is the total end of brain activity, psychedelics allow us to infer, what that might be like. And some psychedelic trips, ego dissolution, they are very difficult to go through. It's the loss of your sense of individual self. It's the feeling that you are losing control of your mind. It can be very anxiety-inducing. So first change for me, my death anxiety has returned.
Yeah, but however, can I just raise two objections? I mean, first of all, of course, a lot of people would say, who are atheists would say, death, I would love to believe in heaven. Death terrifies me because it'll be the end of all the good stuff as well as the bad stuff. No more loved ones, no more this, no more that. There's that reaction, but also I would think that isn't dissolution into the pool of consciousness kind of the end of your experience per se, which is roughly what a materialist expects?
It's the same end of your experience as waking up from a dream is the end of your dream avatar. You have a little avatar in the dream. The dream is a dissociative state. Remember this. During the dream, you identify with your avatar, but you're dissociated from the parts of your mind that are creating the rest of the dream. You don't think the rest of the dream is being done by you. You think you are inhabiting it and not doing it. That dissociative state comes to an end the moment you wake up and then you realize it was my dream. I was doing the whole thing. Yeah. And your dream avatar dies. He's toast. He's gone the moment you wake up. But you don't mourn the end of your dream avatar because you know that the subjectivity in him is the same as the subjectivity in you while you are awake.
Right.
So what you really are and have always been doesn't die. What dies is a state of consciousness and a particular narrative of self. Those die. Moreover, you remember your dream potentially. So nothing is lost. So I don't think when we die, it's the end of us. It's the end of the narrative of a personal self. It's the dissolution of the ego. That I know from direct experience can be extraordinarily hard. It's painful beyond pain.
Yeah, but isn't that temporary? I mean,
it's temporary.
The death is temporary, and then suddenly you're just the whole universe. And how bad could that be?
Yes, but temporary as it is, if it's pretty bad, be tortured for a day. It's just a day, man. Why are you going to be worried?
So it's the moment of death that terrifies you.
I don't know how long that will be. I think the notion of time is.
I see.
Is a life determined thing. You can have a psychedelic trip that lasts 2 minutes, but it feels like 100,000 years. And look, as I was saying, if you're going to be tortured for a day, why would you worry about it? It's just a day, man. You'll be okay afterwards. But it's still a day of torture. Right. So no, I don't like that prospect. It may not be like that.
No, it may not be. People, I mean, some people report positive near-death experiences and so on.
Exactly.
So we don't know. Okay, so what's the upside? That's the downside for you of your worldview.
The upside is the return of meaning. Because under materialism, life and pain go hand in hand. We all have a lot of pain. Not only physical pain, psychological suffering, regrets, anxieties, depression, all kinds of things. And we think that everything we learn, our process of maturation, the insights we gather through all that pain, that all of that is for nothing because insights are in consciousness. Consciousness ends when you die. Therefore, your insights are lost. So all that pain was for nothing. Now, that I don't have anymore because I know the contents of my consciousness survive, just like the memories of my dreams survive when I wake up. And therefore, the insights survive. And therefore, all the pain in my life that leads to insights is a means to contribute to nature. In religious language, people would say, your life is a service to God, even if you're suffering. Yes, not because God enjoys watching you suffer. The mind of nature didn't put you in this situation in a premeditated way. I don't think the mind of nature is metacognitive. It doesn't have higher level mental functions. But because of your suffering, you arrive at insights. You arrive at certain understandings about what is, that once you die, become available to a broader cognitive context because your dissociative boundary dissolves. So all of the contents of your cognition throughout life are now available to nature at large. And that's a contribution to nature. So life in that sense is sacrificial, like Carl Jung used to say. Life is sacrificial in this sense. And even if you suffer, the suffering has meaning. Something will change in nature forever because you suffered. And that something will be a positive. You're contributing an insight to the raw mind of nature that wasn't there before. And that will never cease to be, will never cease to exist. Something will change, something small, but something will change in the universe forever because you've been here and you suffered. And that's a way to be present to life that Western culture has forgotten since the Enlightenment. We did have it before. We had religious metaphors to capture that. Your suffering was a service to God. Of course, we misinterpret that, thinking that God was a sadist. Mm-hmm. That's not the point. The point is that your suffering will lead to insights that God cannot have, or the mind of nature cannot have, unless it goes through this amazing dissociative experience that we call life.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that a materialist could they could give themselves the same consolation. I mean, I can say that. I can say, of course, that presupposes that I mean, I am someone who actually writes about ideas. That's part of what I do for a living. I put them out there, and if I assume that on balance there's more productive ones than damaging ones that I put out there, I can console myself with that kind of consolation, right? I mean, even though I'm a materialist, or are you saying, in your view, you are inherently, we don't have to evaluate your ideas to say you're making a contribution, or what? How is your consolation different from mine?
Yes, I'm saying that you are inherently making a contribution, whether you know it or not, whether you want it or not, it does not matter. You are doing it. It's a fact of reality. Live with it. But that, to me, is a good fact of reality. Look, can materialists live with meaning? Of course. We know in psychology there is this phenomenon called fluid compensation. If you lose a transcendent source of meaning, you will fluidly compensate with a temporal source of meaning. Like you contribute to the great edifice of science, and your contribution to that edifice will survive you. So there is still meaning in your life. This is all valid. Fluid compensation is not invalid, but it is always conditional. Because if tomorrow a comet hits the Earth and life ends and the planet ends and all human life ends and all of our records end, then it will have been for nothing. It was always for nothing. If it ever comes to an end, then it was always for nothing. And under analytic idealism, it cannot come to an end because the mind of nature is what is. It's what there is. Beginnings and ends happen within it, not to it.
Okay.
So that returns. And then there are other implications, Robert. I mean, my view of health now is different. I think if the body is what our dissociative mentation looks like, even the areas of our mentation that we cannot introspect into and are seemingly, quote, unconscious, they're just not metacognitive. They're not unconscious, but we cannot access them directly. The quality of those mental processes look like your health. They look like your body. Your body is what those inner, deep mental processes look like. So talk therapy can have direct physical effects on your health. How well you integrate your experiences in life, how well you are present to the world, how well you deal with your regrets and your anxieties, that has a direct bearing on your physical well-being, because your physical well-being is what those mental processes deeply ingrained look like. And that's an account for the placebo effect, which we know is not only there, but it's enormous and growing. Great source of worry for drug companies that have to prove their drugs are better than placebo. Placebos are getting better, so the threshold is getting higher for them. But we don't have an account for how placebo can happen. Well, analytic idealism gives you an account of that. Your mental state is what is portrayed through your physicality. Your physicality is what your inner mental state looks like, which doesn't mean that if you have a bad thought, you're going to get cancer. Actually, research shows that it is repressed anger that you don't know you have, that correlates with higher incidence of cancer. It's your total mental inner life that counts, not your egoic inner life, not the part of your inner life that you're explicitly aware of and can report to others and to yourself even. It's your so-called unconscious mind that counts. So yeah, many things changed in my life, meaning my understanding of health, the way I relate to other people. I relate to other people as parts of me. My level of empathy has grown so much since I was in my 20s. I had very little empathy in my 20s. Today, I despair of seeing how pigs are treated. They are products now. Life has been turned into products. We see life as a product that goes through a manufacturing line. Their lives is their manufacturing process. And that fills me with despair, because I know that all the anxiety, all the despair induced in those animals, the memories of all that, they are waiting for me when I die. Because when I die, I am the whole. I will be them. I will have the memory of their dreams, if you know what I mean. And I'm filled with despair. I'm filled with despair with the prospect of war in Ukraine and between Russia and Ukraine. Not only because I relate a lot to Russian people.
A lot of these things bother me too. I mean, I believe pigs have sentience, so I'm bothered by their suffering. But now I don't believe I'm ever going to merge with it. But there's that difference. But if you believe you will, it becomes a very egoistic fear. Like you will suffer, they're suffering, at least in memory. Yeah.
And the memory of suffering can be as bad as the suffering, as we know from post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah. I will say as long as we're talking about animals, I have 2 dogs. One of them does not make much eye contact. He just looks away while you pet him. The other one is really intense about eye contact. And like you can stare into his eyes. And, that's very hard to do with a human being because, as some anthropologist once said, if 2 people maintain eye contact for 10 seconds, it means they're either going to fight or make love. It just doesn't happen with people that they just keep staring into each other's eyes. And I will say the closest I ever come to having the sense that it's consciousness that's fundamental is when I'm staring into my dog's eyes. It's like there's something going on here that's really deep, and there's a connection being made between us that's more fundamental than the physical stuff, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but look, life is constantly telling us that, because you were always cooped up in consciousness. There is nothing that has ever happened to you that was not in your consciousness. Yeah. Everything that is not consciousness is a vague theoretical abstraction, an unnecessary one, and one that doesn't explain anything. So the whole of life is telling you that your whole life is a play in consciousness and of consciousness. It has never been anything else. It is so close to us. It's so much under our noses that we don't see it anymore. It's like fish not knowing what water is.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree with that. Okay. Well, this has been fascinating. I mean, I'm not sure I want to work to really accept your worldview now that I know it would mean merging with pig suffering. But it has upsides, as you noted. So thank you. Yeah, go ahead. You're going to say something?
No, just to reassure you on that, I think the mind of nature has many, many, many experiences, unfathomably many, that all that pig suffering will be a small part of it. Very tiny, maybe even inconsequential.
Well, you should tell yourself that more often. Yeah, it sounds like that's a message for you, Bernardo.
That's what I tell myself in the mirror. Yeah. But when I witness that suffering, when I think it's happening, I still go into despair. Well, but yeah, I have to deal with it.
As one should. Well, this has been really interesting. Let me say again, some books of yours are The Idea of the World. I think that's a collection of papers. Decoding Schopenhauer's Metaphysics. That's your most recent one. Why Materialism is Baloney.
The most recent one is Science Ideated.
Oh, okay. Science Ideated. Okay. Even more recent than 2020. You're putting them out pretty fast. Congratulations on that. Where else can people, do you have a Twitter handle or anything you want to advertise or a website?
Yeah, Twitter handler is at Bernardo Kastrup, Kastrup with a K and a P for Peter at the end. My website is bernardokastrup.com. And from the website, you have links to everything: free papers, free essays, videos, podcasts, links to my YouTube channel, Twitter handle, Facebook, the whole thing. You find everything from there. Okay.
And I on Twitter am at Robert Writer, but I got to say, I don't tweet about consciousness a lot. So that may or may not be of interest to people. But thank you so much, Bernardo. It's been a lot of fun. I hope we'll talk again.
It's been a pleasure, Robert. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the opportunity.